My guest this morning is Dr. Matthew Teutsch, and he is another one of the contributors to the book we've been exploring. I just need to call it off right in front of me correctly. Illmatic Consequences, the clapback to opponents of critical race theory. Many of you may know the letter CRT. Well, Dr. Teutsch is a part of that project. And so Dr. Teutsch is an instructor at Piedmont University in Demorest, Georgia. He maintains Interminable Rambling, a blog about literature, composition, culture, and pedagogy. He has published articles and book reviews in various venues, including Lear, Melis, Mississippi Quarterly, African American Review, and Callaloo. Dr. Teutsch's research focuses on African American, Southern, and 19th century American literature. He has written on Ernest J. Gaines, Charles Chesnutt, George Washington Cable, Catherine Maria Sedgwick, and others. His projects include, but are not limited to, a collected edition of scholarly work on Frank Yerby and the ways that authors such as James Baldwin, Ernest J. Gaines, William Melvin Kelly, Frank Yerby, Alice Walker, and other African-American authors in the mid to late 20th century explore racist thought in the white psyche. For 15 years, he taught at the secondary and post-secondary level. His teaching has included English composition and American literature, colonial through the present. Matthew is a firm believer in active learning in the classroom. This involves everything from classroom discussions that involve tools such as wikis to larger projects where students construct products that teach their peers and me as well. Welcome to the Reading Circle microphone, none other than Dr. Matthew Teutsch. Actually, he's PhD, so we'll say it the other way, Matthew Teutsch, PhD. Dr. Teutsch, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, welcome to the Reading Circle. As I shared with you when we were talking a couple of minutes ago, we have been working our way through the book, Illmatic Consequences, the clapback to opponents of critical race theory. And that book is published by Universal Right Publications, LLC. And the CEO of that particular publishing company, she's been on the show as well as three other members who have contributed to the book. I know LaTanya White has been on. She was on and talked about her chapter last week. Bijan Eric Jordan came on. He talked about his chapter. And now this week, I have Dr. Teutsch, and he's going to talk about his chapter. But before we even get into that, Dr. Teutsch, I just read your bio. And, you know, for me, one of my first questions, even though I don't have a question list, one of my first questions is kind of like, where did this all begin? Where did it all start? And we're going back to, like, grade school, talking grammar school, elementary school, high school. How did you become interested in what you ultimately came to do?
So there's a few things with that. But, well, I got to ask, where did you get the bio from? Because I forgot to send you one accidentally.
Well, I do my homework, and I did have to do some looking and researching and some editing, but I did find it on one of the sites online. I forget which one. Is that not you?
Yeah, that's me. That's kind of what I thought.
Okay.
Because there was one thing. Well, there was one point I needed to correct. Sounds too harsh, I know, but there's one point I need to change. That I'm the director of the Lillian E. Smith Center.
Okay.
At Piedmont.
Great.
So I do teach English, but I'm over the center. But so somebody asked me this question the other day too, because it's something I've thought about. I'm from Louisiana originally, so from North Louisiana, which is totally different than South Louisiana. If you've ever been there, anything south of I-10 is, you know, Cajun and different than anything north of I-10.
I've been to New Orleans. That's the part of Louisiana. I've been to New Orleans.
Well, you've had good food. Go to Lafayette and get some really good food.
Oh, all right.
So, Northwest Louisiana to me is kind of like Texas and kind of like Arkansas. So I grew up there, you know. First generation college student was always like, I got to go to college. I'm an only kid. So I went to college down the road, have no clue how I ended up in college down the road. I just ended up in college, you know, whatever. wanted to study biology. That didn't work out because chemistry is hard. So I switched to education. And I still did biology education, but minored in English. So I taught high school for about a year or two, taught English and biology, thought that was too much. This was back in the early 2000s. So I went back and got my master's. The connection with African American lit, I think, is something I've kind of pondered and thought about. And the connection that I've kind of come up with at this point, and of course, as we know, stories may change, but I read Invisible Man sometime between teaching high school, I think, and going back and get my master's. And it just connected with me, and I didn't know why. I was early 20s. But I think part of it for me, looking back, is I was kind of the outsider kid a little bit. I'm white, heterosexual, cisgender, whatever. So, but I was still one of those kids that wasn't cool in high school, went to a private school. So I kind of gravitated towards underground music and stuff like that. And I think that's kind of the connection. Now that I kind of look back on it, but doing Invisible Man and then doing African American Lit for my master's and then for my doctorate kind of led me to different things. And then moving away, looking back at the history of the area where I grew up, the civil rights history of where I grew up, the history during Reconstruction, the racial violence that occurred there, not just there, but this is just an example. But looking at that and then seeing kind of the situation, the way things are actually as they are now, and looking back at my own childhood, be like, oh, I see how these things are segregated and how these things have been set up in my own community. So that's a really long, kind of broad answer, but I really think it's kind of, does that make sense?
No, it does. As a matter of fact, I don't mind long answers because this is radio. And so it's not television that we get a chance to see you. So long answers are okay because that we're talking. And you kind of answered some of the questions I was going to ask or point out. And that was the fact that you mentioned it was almost the opposite, that you now, as the Caucasian child, felt like the outsider. So I'm assuming the school you went to, was the makeup of it was not predominantly Caucasian.
No, it was a private school, so it was predominantly Caucasian. So I'm Baptist, technically Southern Baptist, and it was a Catholic private school. There were class distinctions, of course. I mean, that was kind of part of it. And of course, I was an awkward kid. I mean, I think it's just the things I was interested in and kind of quieter and things like that too. So I think that's part of it. But yeah, the makeup was definitely predominantly white.
Okay, so even that makes it even more interesting because you're saying, because of your awkwardness or at least your perceived awkwardness as a child or as a person.
Awkwardness.
Right. That's what made you feel kind of like the outsider. Now, this is the thing. I'm currently working in a doctoral program about social justice leadership. And we're talking about the things, exactly what you were just talking about, the whole thing in terms of inclusion and exclusion and how, sometimes ourselves make us feel a certain way. Because yesterday we did a whole exercise on the difference between fitting in versus belonging. And part of the belonging piece it was on both sides. Like you now as the individual had to feel like you belong as well as the group had to make you feel like you belong. Versus fitting in was kind of like somewhat one-sided. Like I got to do all these different things to help you make me feel accepted. That was kind of like the fitting in piece. But the belonging piece is I feel like I belong here. You make me feel like I belong here. So you're right down the right street because what I'm hearing from you is I felt awkward. Now, I don't know if that's what the group made you feel like or not, but you felt awkward based on whatever you felt was causing you to feel awkward, whether it was being Southern Baptist or what have you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, okay, so now, all right, so now we're getting here, we're working our way to the book. Which, I found your essay very interesting from the standpoint because I'm a Christian as well. And like I said, the first part of the show, I play gospel music. The third part of the show, I put the gospel music back on. And many times I'm giving Christian commentary. So when I read your piece of the book, it was very interesting, especially with everything going on around the country and the last few years and so forth and so on. So how did you find out about Illmatic Consequences, the clapback to opponents of critical race theory?
Well, it was through Walter.
Walter Greason? Dr. Greason?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I've known Walter for the joys of Twitter when Twitter was a very, good networking apparatus. It took me forever to get onto Twitter because I just didn't want to have to learn it. And then when I finally got onto Twitter, it served as actually a very good networking tool when I was actually surprised.
Correct.
And Walter was one of the people that I met through Twitter doing, studies on comics. And I think that's probably when I started looking at Black Panther and things like that. And we've just connected. He's had me up there to New Jersey. I've had him down here to do something. It's just been, collaborative stuff. And he's a great guy. And he just reached out to me and asked if I wanted to submit anything. And then my blog has so many blog posts. I kind of pulled some things from my blog and kind of reworked them a little bit to add to it. And it fits because one of the things I've been interested in the past couple of years is looking at this. It's not new, but looking at kind of the illumination on Christian nationalism. So that kind of fit, I think, perfectly, especially at this moment, too, after we've seen the Moms for Liberty stuff that's just come up recently. There was a comment by, I forgot the guy's name, but somebody from Liberty University who was at a gala or something, speaking with the news thing and saying that we should get back to, or that Hitler knew that education was important, and Mao and Stalin, that you had to get the kids. And this was, I think, a Christian conference, or at least the guy was connected with Liberty University. So these types of things and more, I think, are kind of important to disentangle right now.
No, absolutely. And see, this is the thing. As a matter of fact, I want you to define Christian nationalism. I want you to, for the listening audience. You may know, I may know, or maybe we don't, because everybody may have their own different definition. But help us understand the definition that you're using when you say Christian nationalism.
So I don't think I have it pulled up here, but Samuel Perry and Andrew Whited, I'm not going to get their definition specific, but they define it, I think, in the Cross and the Flag and other places. But it's basically this merging of Christianity, and specifically white evangelical Christianity, with patriotism, and this overlapping and kind of wrapping of the cross and the flag. It can be more than that too. And kind of the end goal, of course, is to have a Christian nation, because the idea is that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, which it wasn't, if you look at it. I'm actually looking at something right here too. One of the theologians that Lillian Smith admired was Paul Tillich, mid-century theologian. And in Dynamics of Faith, this was 1956, he writes this, and this kind of sums up a little bit of it. If a national group makes the life and growth of a nation its ultimate concern, it demands that all other concerns, economic well-being, health and life, family aesthetic, and cognitive truth, justice, and humanity be sacrificed. And Christian nationalism sees itself as, promoting Christianity and making that the main concern over, no matter if somebody in the country isn't Christian, if they're Buddhist or Muslim, atheist, whatever. And then that hurts everything.
Now, the thing that I'm fascinated and going to be fascinated with this discussion is because it's kind of like the crossover or the intersection between religion and politics to a degree. And supposedly we have a separation between church and state, but every now and again they do cross over. Now, it's interesting that we're talking now here in terms of Christian nationalism, because, and again, I've been black all my life and I will die black, just like you're Caucasian and you will die Caucasian. But there's even when we come into, and I'm very frank, by the way, the older I've gotten, the less filter I have. And I'm not to insult, and I'm not trying to be rude, I'm not trying to, but we call it like it is. So in terms of, my mother carried me in her womb at the same church that I'm in right now. So for almost 61 years now, I've been a part of St. Luke Baptist Church. It is a black church. And one of the statements Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made was the most segregated hour, and I'm paraphrasing him, the most segregated hour is 11 o'clock a.m. on Sunday morning. Okay. So we have like what we call the quote unquote the black church. That's our experience. And then you have, the white church or the Southern Baptist or what have you. So let's talk a little bit about that, because to me, Christian is Christian regardless of what skin color you are. I mean, it's like Jesus, if we start talking Christ and Christian and we can make, if I want Jesus to be black, then so be it. If you want Jesus to be white, so be it. Because the pictures that we always see of Jesus was a depiction by Michelangelo or whoever the artist was that, made him blonde and blue-eyed. That does not necessarily mean that that's the way it has to be, because if you look biblically, the Bible describes him as having ruddy hair and darker skin. So, I don't even want to get caught up in that, but what is this thing between, white church versus black church, if you know?
So, I mean, historically, I don't know the origins, of course, of everything, what I do know is from things I've kind of studied and looked at, and just from observation, right? The black church, I wouldn't just say the black church, I would say other strains of Christianity, even some strains of white Christianity, or mainline Christianity in the U.S., take the teachings of Jesus and the Bible, and it's social justice oriented, and for specific reasons, for specific groups. I mean, that's kind of obvious, I would say, too. And then the white evangelical church, or at least the white church, and some of the things I've looked at, too, use it for their own means to uphold things like slavery, right? I mean,
right, and see, and it's interesting, and I want you to keep going, but you introduced the term evangelical, because now that gets into a whole different sect or denomination or what have you. So, but keep going though. I just wanted to while you said it, I wanted to put a pin there. But go ahead.
Yeah. So I was basically evangelical. I mean, Southern Baptist is evangelical, but the slave Bible basically, used all the verses to say, hey, you should submit to us because you're inferior, because you're black and you're enslaved, and slaves submit to their masters, right? And it was a way to actually use the Bible to make these claims and to justify them. And then, of course, the other things with enslavers, too, was, well, if enslaved people have souls, then they can be Christian, so we can't teach them to read the Bible. We can't teach them to be saved, whatever. I mean, Phyllis Wheatley's On Being Brought from Africa, I think, is a great poem, because there's so much underneath the surface there. Even though she says that you brought me from Africa to save me, there's just this really kind of underlying question that she doesn't answer. It's kind of in the silences that Robert Hayden kind of pulls out that, and you enslaved me. One of the things I wanted to kind of say, too, is I don't know if you've seen, I think it's Take This Hammer, James Baldwin's documentary, when he's in San Francisco, but he goes to a church, a Catholic church that's been burned down, and the guy who's touring him around tells him that, they're raised this money, and Baldwin's standing there with him. He's like, yeah, they basically know how to hustle. They know how to do it. Like, they raise like millions of dollars to, refurbish the church. And then he kind of ends on this. I think this is very telling. Standing outside of the church, this is what he says to the guy. I don't even, I may want to back up, but I'll just leave it here. Sorry. He says, I don't even think they're Christians. And I know they're not, because I know I was raised Christian. My daddy and my mama were very religious. And if you know James Baldwin, his stepdad was a preacher.
Correct.
He was a street preacher.
Correct.
And they knew that white Christians were not Christians because of the way they treated black people. And the Christian church in this country has never, in my experience, as far as I know, been Christian. The record proves the Christian church is bankrupt. And he's echoing, I mean, if you've ever read Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July,
correct,
he's echoing that. So it's this long history. It kind of gets to that question, too, of, the black church and the white church. But I think he sums up a lot with that.
No, it's interesting because I'm going to, listening audience, I always say, and hopefully you've been with me since 6, but certainly if you didn't get up at 6, I get it as early. I really hope you've been with me since 7, because this is when we get into the discussion. Now, I'm not saying the first hour is not relevant, because it is, but whenever I get into the discussions with the various authors, that's the part I really need folks tuned in. So I truly hope you're there. My guest this morning is Dr. Matthew Teutsch. And we are just we're working our way up to his contribution in the book, Illmatic Consequences, the clapback to opponents of critical race theory. Now, there's a lot of reasons I'm excited about his particular contributions. One, because I'm having the opportunity to read this through the lens now of a doctoral student in social justice leadership. And his contribution is smack dab in the middle of that. The other thing is this. Dr. Teutsch is for lack of a better phrase, I'm being kind when I say Caucasian, but he's white. I always love the way Martin Luther King says, our white brothers and sisters. Dr. Teutsch is one of my white brothers. And he is now taking up the mantle to put this out there, to put this message out there. And yes, just yesterday, I was in class and I expressed, because this is the thing in terms of social justice and civil rights and all of this. The push has always come from those who have been oppressed. In order for things to really change, the change is going to have to come from the folks who are doing the oppressing. So when I see and read a contribution like this from one of my white brothers, that's whenever I know change can come if enough of them come to the same realizations that Dr. Teutsch has come to. So with that being said, his chapter is chapter 15, Christian Nationalism and the Comic, Incognegro or Incognegro. And the first line says, Matt Johnson and Warren Plessy's Incognegro, a graphic mystery, focuses on constructions of race and the ways in which whites use these constructions to maintain power or achieve power. This graphic novel does not extensively engage in an examination of Christian nationalism, looking at the intersections between white supremacy and the church. But there are moments that cause readers to think about these intersections. The essay focuses on the ways that Incognegro highlights the social construction of race and how those social constructions manifest themselves in Christian nationalism to maintain control and power. Dr. Teutsch, talk to me about that opening line.
Well, can I shift a little bit to something that you said just a second ago about
Sure.
Individuals, who are doing the oppressing, actually, being part of the ones who are changing it, right?
Correct.
I think that's where Lillian Smith's important. So, and she's a big part of the essay, and I'm actually working on a couple of new essays about Christian nationalism with Lillian Smith. And if you're familiar with, King's work, specifically A Letter from Birmingham Jail, he names her as one of the good whites, essentially, who were putting in the work. I think she's a very important figure that if I knew about this woman when I was growing up, things would have moved a lot faster. I guess I would say most of your listeners, and you probably know the story of King this is a story I always tell about it because I think it's the most important one to get people to understand who she was. You know the story about King being arrested and then put in jail, and then the Kennedys getting him out during the sit-ins. In 1960.
Correct.
So that sit-in was led by students, of course, at Morehouse and other HBCUs in Atlanta, and they were arrested in Fulton County, which is Atlanta. All the students were let go, and he was sent to DeKalb County because he was on probation. He had a traffic ticket. He paid the ticket, but the judge put him on probation, so they sent him to DeKalb just because he was King, basically. And then somebody sent him down to Reidsville, which was the maximum security prison, and that's when the Kennedys got him out of jail, and that's when when John F. Kennedy won the election and Nixon lost it. Basically, that was really a big reason Nixon lost it.
Correct.
The parts of that story that aren't told, and Coretta writes about this in her memoir. it's brief, but she writes about it. But there's two parts of that story that Lillian Smith's involved with. Actually more, but the two key parts are that traffic violation was from the spring of 1960. Lillian Smith had breast cancer, so they were him and Coretta took Lillian out to eat, from my understanding, and they were taking her back to the hospital. And it was Lillian, Coretta, is my assumption or my kind of reading, and then Lillian, and then Martin in the car. My kind of thought is that Martin was driving and Lillian was sitting in the front. So a black guy and a white woman.
Right.
They were pulled over. The cop didn't realize it was King until he got to the front of the car, basically, and then found out it was that troublemaker King.
Right.
And then he ticketed him. So King had just moved back from Alabama, so he ticketed him for not having a Georgia license, basically. So that probation was from that traffic stop. The other part of that, one thing I kind of found out recently too, is SNCC had a meeting to lead up to that sit-in on October 19th at Mount Moriah, and Lillian Smith gave the keynote speech.
Wow.
So she is a white woman, very intimately from Northeast Georgia, who lived in Northeast Georgia, God, all her life. Not all, she was born in Florida, but she's intimately involved with this, yet she's not marching or anything. And the narratives we always tell ourselves, at least the narratives I always heard, and I think they're still told her that, well, the whites who came were from outside the South, which is BS.
Right. That's right.
So if I learned about somebody like this, what would it have done? And then I want to share this. I know we're probably going to get to it. My favorite line, so one of the essays that I pull from for my essay in the collection, Nomadic Consequences, is Lillian Smith's essay on the white Christian and his conscience. And I think it was written about 43. I can't get a direct date on it, but it's between 43 and 45. But this is how she opens that essay. And you could read the sentence and you can think of Anthea Butler, Dante Stewart, anybody, black or white, who's writing on Christian nationalism today, and it sounds like something they would come up with. But this sentence would also receive pushback in a lot of states that, were passing divisive concept laws like Florida or whatever. But she writes, ever since the first white Christian enslaved the first black man, the conscience of America has been hurting. And
wow,
that's a white woman from Georgia, 1943, 1944. And then later in the essay, too, she gets to the point of, she says, we don't call it, well, that Du Bois said that the problem of the 20th century is the color line. And we've always called it, quote unquote, the Negro problem, right?
Correct.
She says it's not the Negro problem, it's the white problem.
Correct. And
when do we switch this?
Yes, and that's exactly what I was saying, and the point I made in my class yesterday. If you look around the room in my class, we have a very diverse cohort. I mean, very diverse, probably the most diverse cohort they've had in the program. And the commentary I made was, well, look who's sitting around this table who's talking about social justice. Who should be sitting around this table is a table or a horseshoe full of white men talking exactly as me and you are talking right now. And the thing is, folks need to be real clear. Throughout these various movements, white people were a part of them. And as Matthew just said, right, they tried to make it appear as if they were imported. That's not true. They were homegrown. They were raised and brought up right alongside the blacks who were in the South.
Right. And again, that's a history that I think is important for my kids to learn.
Correct.
For any kid. And
correct.
And if you don't learn it, all you hear is that King, we know the lines that we give to King. The Southern Poverty Law Center calls it a 9-word problem. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, I have a dream.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So, what do we do? And then when you have these issues of trying to squash even the teaching of history, which
correct.
The teaching of history isn't CRT.
Correct.
I mean, CRT is totally different. So how do you do it? I looked at the Georgia standards, and there's surprisingly not a lot even on the civil rights movement.
Correct.
For history. So I don't know.
And and that's interesting, especially because Dr. King was such an integral figure to that, and so for it not to be in there, that's interesting to say the least.
Well, such an integral figure in Georgia.
That's what I mean, in the state itself. Yeah. That's because you said the Georgia standards, you didn't really see it, and that's why I say that's really ironic because he was from Georgia.
Right.
Okay, I'm going back to the book. These moments in Inca Negro play into the larger discussions surrounding white evangelicals and Christian nationalist attacks on critical race theory and intersectionality. Interestingly enough, Dr. Teutsch, today in class, we're going to be talking about intersectionality. Well, let's talk about, I know there's a God, because recently the presidents of the Southern Baptist seminaries recommitted themselves to the Baptist faith and message, and by extension, as Jamar Tisby 2020 notes, whiteness, quote unquote. Tisby argued that Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to Christianity in the United States. Christian nationalism is an interwoven network wrapping Christianity tightly in the robes of patriotism, embracing the nation just as much as, if not more so, than the Christian faith. Talk a little bit about that statement, because there's certain statements I have highlighted that I said, I got to ask him about this.
Well, I mean, I keep thinking about, growing up and seeing the American flag next to the Christian flag, right? And there's nothing wrong with patriotism. I think
right.
Even I always go to James Baldwin's quote where he says, and I'm going to paraphrase it basically, but he says, I'm an American, basically born and raised here, and for that right, I have a right to criticize, the nation. I love this nation more than any other, and for that right, I have the right to criticize her, right?
Correct.
The issue kind of comes in, I think, is when you are so enthralled with having the cross and the flag totally ensconced in one another that you can't separate to see the injustices that connection is doing. And when you're pushing things that are hindering individuals who you supposedly love, love your neighbor as yourself, right? One of the things that kind of, I need to look back at it. I have it pulled up, but I haven't looked back at it. That struck me when I was starting to do all this was the fact that Jesus's first sermon, or at least I think the first sermon in Luke that he gives, is the Day of Jubilation.
Correct.
The 50-year Day of Jubilation, where is, debts are paid, slaves are freed, all of this stuff, right? And how can you kind of even justify things and laws that you want to pass to hurt people and hinder people when that is his first sermon?
But see, that's why all of the moves, and it's almost to a degree like Christianity was weaponized. It was weaponized right. against certain groups. And you're absolutely right. I could not agree with you more.
But everything is weaponized, right? It's easy
correct.
It's easy to turn women submit to your wives.
Correct.
Complementarianism or something like that, right?
Correct.
So I think there's a lot more going on than, it's using the Bible or any tool to actually support what you wanted.
Correct.
That's what it is.
Correct. I mean, that's how, systemic things get put into place. That's how things, or shall I say it this way, that's how things become systemic. You're absolutely right. You can use whatever you want to support your view.
But then that gets into, I was listening to something the other day, but then that gets into the reproduction, too, of parents to children or educators to children.
Correct.
Or, whatever. And Lillian Smith recognized that children were kind of I won't say the crux isn't the right word, but they were a focal point. You need to teach children, and I'm going to read you a lengthy quote in a second. Can you hear me?
I can. As a matter of fact, it's interesting that you're bringing that up, because I highlighted in the book your part that says Smith knew the effects of racism and nationalism on the psychological development of children and their impact on the oppressor.
Okay, yeah. So there's two things. I'm going to read you a lengthy quote and then tell you a little story she gave to. So this is a section from The White Christian as Conscience. All right, and this is talking about the importance of knowing and examining yourself as someone in a position of power. Excuse me. So this is what she says. There are other things we know today also about segregation. Not only is it true that we Jim Crow Jesus Christ each time we Jim Crow another human being. I love that line. For the spirit of Jesus is in every living soul, but we Jim Crow our children, segregating them from those human experiences that make their personality creative and rich and good, that make it grow. Sometimes we need to remember that not only does the body need vitamins, the personality must have vitamins also. Self-esteem, belief in one's importance as a person, dignity, emotional security, no child can do without. These vitamins can be given no child, white or colored, Christian or Jew, in a segregated culture. It isn't only the Negro child, the Jewish child, the Mexican child who suffers. The white Christian child is injured too also. For we know well today that to hate tears up the heart and mind as much as to be hated. To be blind to human dignity, to be callous to human need, warps a personality as much as shame and suffering. We know that to feel superior is as harmful to a child's growth as to feel inferior. To segregate is as injurious as to be segregated. A child's personality grows by reaching out to others, by feeling identified with them, by acknowledging the common dignity of all men. And that's what she would do at the camp that she ran. So she ran Laurel Falls Camp for Girls from, her dad started in 1920. She took it over in 1925. She ran it from 1925 to 1948. It was the first private camp in Georgia for girls. She had Jewish campers. She couldn't have black campers. This was the mountains of northeast Georgia.
Correct.
She did have some of the black kids from the town come and interact with the campers. But she tells a story in Killers of the Dream, which is her 1949 memoir. She tells a story about a camper who, after they put on the play that kind of addressed some of these issues and all the things that kind of impact somebody, a camper who'd been there multiple years, she was 17. The camper comes up to her and basically says, why are you teaching us these things? And why are you teaching us to hate our parents and all of this type of stuff? She's saying, if I go back home and ask a black girl to go to church with me or go to the ice cream shop with a black girl, my family and the community is going to ostracize me. So what she says that I know these things are right. I know that what I need to do is right. I need to build these bridges, but I'm not going to do it. She tells Lillian that I'm going to raise my kids to love money and to basically do what I do, right? And Lillian's response always gets me. She basically turns to the girl and basically says, you're just going to make little Nazis out of them. And the girl's like, yeah, I'm scared to death. I think that that's a really important conversation, too, is even though somebody knows they know it's right, they haven't looked, they're scared of what they look at themselves in the mirror.
Correct.
That's another kind of thing that Smith uses, the mirror.
And what's interesting about that is because essentially it's the same argument that's being made now for trying to ban these books and not teach the histories. We don't want our children to feel as if we were bad people. And, first off, let me be clear, when I'm not doing radio or I'm not in school, my day job, as they call it, is I'm a principal of a school. So I work with kids every day. And the points that you are making are critical. The fact that we're trying, or, you have states like Florida and folks like DeSantis and states like Texas and some other states around the country that is trying to ban education for the most part. Because, these moves are counter-education, because education is about teaching the facts as they are, whatever it is, and let people make their own decisions one way or the other. But the fact that you're trying to now ban it or, for lack of a better term, whitewash it, says something there, because it's going back to what you were just saying. Well, it's about, we don't want our kids to, well, how is it you don't care about anybody else's kids? And going back to, what you were saying about the quote you just read about in terms of hate it also impacts the hater. That goes back to Dr. King's quote about what affects one directly affects everybody else indirectly.
Right.
So I mean, you're spot on with that. I don't know if there's more you wanted to say about the particular quote or not, but I'm sitting here listening to you read that, and I'm just saying this is history repeating itself all over again, or maybe it never has changed.
Well, I mean, there's two things you were saying there. Is one, you have the laws, and if you look at the laws in these states, they're all basically written the same way. I mean, we know how these things work. If you've ever read legislation, it's different groups who are writing these laws and then getting legislators to kind of pass them. So I read the one in Florida and the one here in Georgia, and I think one in Oklahoma, and they're almost identical. The divisive concepts laws or the don't gay laws or whatever. So the divisive concept laws, I think, are my kind of reading of them is they provide a catch-22 basically. So if you say something, that is historically, there are some things in there I agree with, right? That, everybody's created equal. Okay, I agree with that. What I don't agree with is that you can't say that America has done things that are wrong.
Correct.
But anyways, I think the mirror thing is important. Well, let me go back. Sorry. That's something too that's not, new. Look at the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They had a stranglehold on education in the South for a generation, basically. Any book that they deemed
correct,
inappropriate to their ideas, they stamped with.
Correct.
I forgot the stamp, but basically they stamped it and said that this is not a good book.
Correct.
They actually had a whole pamphlet about, what kind of education they wanted to have in school boards and everything. So it's nothing new that we're seeing.
Correct.
The other thing too, I think the mirror image is really important. And Lillian's very steeped in psychoanalysis. Her partner, has a degree in psychology from Columbia. So they were very steeped in psychoanalysis. But and this is the thing that the girl tells her, the mirror is a scary thing because when you're forced to look at yourself, you're forced to recognize the things that are wrong with you.
Correct.
And people don't want to do that. And I don't know how to get past getting somebody to do that, but that's the first step.
I could not agree with you more. And I'm going to say, we've been like in a boot camp in this. It was a residency for these last few days, and we talked about that very thing about the mirror also. And you're at that, but that is what's going to this is the thing. And again, I said this yesterday. The fact that we want to teach the history or teach things as they were is not white bashing. But that's the way it's seen. We're on the defense. In order for you to teach that means you're making me look bad. You're making me look as a white person bad. And interestingly enough, going back to the book, I'm looking at your quote that says, let's see. There was a quote I just saw, and I wonder. Zane, like Smith, countless others, points out that whites do not think of themselves as white, as distinct. Instead, we envision ourselves as, quote, the universal, quote, unquote, the, quote, unquote, norm. Yet that is not the case. This belief comes from Smith, 1942, 1943, points out, the home, the church, the school, in books, and 100 study phrases through 1,000 jokes and innuendos by means of 10,000 unverbalized approvals and disapprovals, where the superiority of the white race was solidified into a sacred code to which our lives were molded. So it's funny that you were mentioning that because I had that piece highlighted as well. The fact that, I heard some preposterous thing that DeSantis, and I don't know if it's true or not, but he came across that he didn't want it mentioned that Rosa Parks was a black woman. I said, well, if you don't mention that Rosa Parks is a black woman, there's no story.
So I think that was from the redone education books, where I don't know if it was him directly who said it. I don't think he said it, but when I remember the education books and the way they kind of reworded things, and they left off that she was black, right? And there were a couple of other examples that they had in there. They basically said that she just sat down on the bus because that's what, and she wasn't supposed to or something. I forgot
right.
What it was. It was basically like the Texas one saying that enslaved people were workers, that the implication was they voluntarily came up to work.
Exactly.
So, but I think that point that you said right there too is, I mean, it's something that's all over everything. And the passage that I'm kind of referencing in Incognito there is Zane. Zane is white enough to pass. Zane is based off of Walter White, partly. You know, the NAACP. I think he was chairman at one point. But what Walter White did, and actually Walter White's daughter played on the stage adaptation of Strange Fruit on Broadway. That's another story. The stage adaptation failed. I mean, it bombed terribly.
Right.
Strange Fruit was Lillian Smith's first novel and most popular novel. But Walter White went to the South. He could pass, and he investigated lynchings. And actually, Lillian and Paula corresponded with him about a lynching that happened, I think, near Paula's hometown. And he wanted information about it, and they were reluctant to give him information. I think it's part of Paula's family or friends were connected with it. So it's kind of an interesting thing, but that's what he did. And Incognito and Zane is based off of that. And that scene that I'm referencing there is he is putting on kind of his passing. He's straightening his hair. He's getting dressed up and all these things. And he's walking through, I think he's walking from Harlem to kind of, I don't know the layout of New York, but it seems like Harlem, he gets on the train, then go to Grand Central Station or Union Station to come south. But you see the diversity change, and then you see this kind of washing away of even features of individuals who are standing outside the big train station. And it's this kind of normalization of whiteness. I'm reading Adichie's Americana right now, and of course she talks about that too. She's Nigerian and is focused on a Nigerian immigrant, but white is normalized, right?
Correct.
So when you say, one of the things in that book, because it's dealing with Obama's election and his kind of ascendance, if I remember correctly, they're talking about pollsters, and they say white women or blacks, right?
Right.
Why is it white women, white suburban white women, or black voters, right?
Right. No, you're absolutely right. Are we still here? Do I still have you?
Whenever we think of anything, right?
Right.
If you think of, I think we've probably seen this discussion. I think things have changed. I haven't seen, but Band-Aids or, nude colored whatever.
Right.
It's white.
No, you're absolutely right. And see, for me, this conversation with you is refreshing because this is a conversation I would have with another black person, but it's rare that I have an opportunity to have it with a white person because what I'm hearing is you get it. And in order for us to really push the ball in social justice and anything else, we're going to have everybody get it. It's not just the oppressed or the marginalized groups get it. The ones who are dominant and are doing the oppressing, they have to get it too in order for this thing to change. And when I have a conversation like this with you, I know some folks are getting, as they always have, like you were saying, you were talking about the Lillian Smiths and others that were a part of the movement. So there's always been folks that got it. It's just not a high enough number. Do you ever get into a situation where folks, other Caucasians now look at you and think you're not Caucasian, or either say, they have derogatory terms in terms of what type of lover you are. Do you ever run into that kind of situation?
Not that I know. I'm in spots where it's very easy to blend in.
Okay.
And of course, with being white, it's very easy to blend in specific things.
But when you're talking counter, because you're talking counter white supremacy, you're talking counter white privilege, you're talking counter to whiteness, you're talking counter to that. So that's my question is, do you now get pushback or being ostracized or ostracization because you're doing that?
I haven't had any kind of experience with it, and I don't know.
That's good.
I mean, I get pushback in the classroom, of course, right? So I remember having a discussion about the tomahawk chop. I mean, I'm a Braves fan. I heard you read the thing earlier. I'm an Atlanta Braves fan. I've grown up an Atlanta Braves fan. I have issues with the tomahawk chop. And the student was, very adamantly pushing back of, well, I can do it. And I'm like, well, yeah, you can do it, but here's the reasons it's wrong. I'm like,
correct. Correct.
That's the thing.
And see, there you hit it spot on, because this is the thing. All right, we'll give grace. There are things folks just don't know. But once you do know, that's whenever the action needs to, like, you don't know what you don't know. But once it's brought to your attention and the reasoning behind it, like you just said, okay, student says, okay, I'm going to do what I want to do anyway. Okay, that's fine. But you can't say that you didn't know. Maybe you didn't know when you were doing the tomahawk chalk before that it was wrong. But now I've enlightened you and you do know it's wrong. And so you're choosing to still be wrong.
Right.
That's different. That's different. When you choose to, it's one thing to say, well, I really didn't know. And it's another thing to be now enlightened and informed and still say, and see, that's part of the problem, not just with that student, but that's part of the problem in the country in general. Not enough people that even once they do learn are willing to make the change.
Well, that gets back. So I know we're wrapping up on time. There's two things I thought about. What you're saying there gets back to that camper who was like, I know these things are right. And whether the person knows they're right or wrong, but, I know these things. I know what you're teaching me is right, but I'm not going to do it because it's too hard. And I think that gets to that too. It's that fear of what is this going to do to me, basically, personally. And the other thing I think about too, and I struggle with that too. I'm like, I live a comfortable, stable life. What am I willing to sacrifice or do? But what are my also, what are the avenues that I can do to teach and educate people, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There's another piece that I would suggest people read from Lillian Smith. You can find it online, called 2 Men in a Bargain. And this is in Killers of the Dream. But it's basically a conversation between a rich white man and a poor white man. And the rich white man says, you can do whatever you want to black people. You can do this as long as you don't touch my money. He's like, you can control the school board, you can control the church, you can do all this stuff. And I think that's another kind of aspect of this that is important to think about too, and something that Du Bois talked about before her and others, the ways that whiteness is flattened. I mean, you always hear the argument that, well, the Irish were, persecuted. They were, but they're white now.
Right.
So whiteness is always changing, but it's always somebody who is in power economically,
correct,
whatever, who is creating the divisions between people below them. So poor whites and black, a lot more in common, at least economically and politically, for what they would benefit from than the rich whites, right? And there's a reason why these wedges have been formed, and they're not new.
And the thing is, on the chain or on the pyramid or whatever you want to call it, poor whites are still above the richest black.
Right.
I mean, that's the way it seems. Like the poor whites is still above Obama.
Go back to I haven't taught early American Lit in a while, but one of the things I did was use different texts. And if you go back and look at Jefferson's notes in the state of Virginia and his social hierarchy, it's whites, Caucasians, I think indigenous, I forget what all groups, and then blacks. But if you go back and look, that's an Enlightenment idea.
Correct.
I think he gets it from Immanuel Kant. I don't remember, but there's even the dictionaries, encyclopedias, it's this idea of this racial stratification.
Correct.
And part of that racial stratification was based on being able to enslave people, right?
Correct. No, that's absolutely right. And that's what it's systemic. That's why we keep saying it's systemic. This is something, the systems that were intentionally put in place, and they're still there. And matter of fact, there are folks who are trying to take us back there, hence the affirmative action turning back of the clock, and some other decisions that are being made. So yes, I could not agree with you more. Matter of fact, there's this quote, based on what you were talking about with white. This is the thing. And when I saw this quote, I saved it. It said, white privilege does not mean your life has not been hard. It means that your skin color is not one of the things making it hard. Right. That leaped out at me, because a lot of times we deny white privilege. So because we denied saying, well, what you're really saying is I get a pass, or I've gotten a pass, and that my life was never hard. And this quote kind of really captures it when it says white privilege. It doesn't mean that your life hasn't been hard. We're not saying that. But it does mean that your skin color isn't one of the things making it harder. To your point of, yeah, you're Irish, but you're seen as white.
Right. I mean, I guess we can end on this. I mean, think about the fact, if you're white and listening, if one of the things that I think about a lot, I mean, there are multiple things, but we have self-checkouts everywhere now. I can go in a store and I can self-checkout, and I don't want to use a plastic bag. I just pick my stuff up and go. Nobody has stopped me ever.
Correct.
You know, nobody has followed me around the store. I think people did follow me around the store when I was in France, but that's probably because they knew I was.
That's because you were in France. That's right.
Right. But you know, these types of things, those are very little things. Correct. But you know, when you notice them, you're like, you start to think about it, and then you see the ways that other people are treated. You know, yeah. I just think that's the one I think about.
Because I just did, I do a podcast as well. And in that podcast, I referenced the whole notion of the how may I help you has a different meaning when it's said to a black person than it is to a white person. The how may I help you to a black person is, I want to make sure you're not shoplifting. The how may I help you to a white person is, stay as long as you want, and if when you get ready to buy, I'm here. And so you're absolutely right with that. And so we have come down to the end. We can talk on, actually, to be honest with you, because I do have more time. But I don't know if you do or not, but this has been...
I have more time. I mean,
okay, great. This has been one of... because
the family hasn't woken up yet. I'm just petting my dog.
So, okay, good. Then we're going to press on for a little bit longer then. Another area that I highlighted was the church serves as the center of this praxis, as preachers and leaders stand in pulpits claiming credibility while espousing white supremacy, which highlights the fact that racism is a feature, not a bug, of American evangelicalism and Christian nationalism. That's a word for you there. Evangelicalism and Christian nationalism. Talk a little, because this is where, because again, you have, going back to Smith with children, you also have parishioners that are going there under the belief that they are learning and talking Christianity in Jesus when hate is really being espoused.
Right. I mean, look at, you mentioned the Southern Baptist Convention. I think that was in my piece, if I remember correctly. But, I mean, look at the statements after George Floyd's death.
Yes, it is in there.
The Conservative Baptist Network, which is kind of an offshoot of the Southern Baptist Network, made a statement after George Floyd's murder. And the Southern Baptist Network was actually pretty, if I remember correctly, pretty straightforward with their kind of denunciation of his murder. But the Conservative Baptist Network wasn't. They basically just gave a comment from, I'm trying to scroll through it real quick. Their actual only biblical verse was Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. That was the only scripture they gave. And then the whole rest of it was basically, I'll just read you what I wrote in this piece right here.
Okay.
So in response to the murder of George Floyd and the protests that arose in the weeks and months following, the Conservative Baptist Network's 7-paragraph statement, so 7 paragraphs, offers a cursory mention of Floyd's murder, I think at the beginning, before moving into the vitriolic language, labeling protesters as, quote, rioters engaging in domestic terrorism, end quote. And, of course, that's from a Christian organization, right? Even calling the rioters, quote, not normal criminals who are rioting to advance a political point. And then biblically, like I said, the only verse they reference is Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. And they also said in there, you know, we denounce police brutality, but you're not really, because that even gets back to King. If you read his I Have a Dream speech, he says, one of the things in there, people ask me, when will we be satisfied? He says, his first answer is when there's an end to police brutality. That is his first
Correct.
So the divisive concept laws, they want you to teach I Have a Dream. It's in the Georgia Standards. If you teach it, you're already going against, quote unquote, the divisive concept laws, and parents can come after you.
Correct.
But yeah, that's a lot there, but that's kind of where that comes from a little bit.
No,
and then you have even. I was going to say, I was looking through here too. I mean, we know the ways that the Bible was used to justify slavery.
Correct.
Mather, his parishioners gave him an enslaved person. There was a minister here. There's an enslaved cemetery behind one of the, some of the churches here, and some of the enslaved were, the pastors. But I was looking at a quote here. Let me go to the Ross Barnett quote. I know Ross Barnett, who was the governor of Mississippi, right? So he actually taught Sunday school. He was a Sunday school teacher.
Correct.
So
not surprised.
This is what Ross Barnett said. The good Lord was the original segregationist. He put the black man in Africa. He made us white because he wanted us white, and he intended that we should stay that way. And he's a Sunday school teacher, right? And then you have
I'm not surprised. And the reason I say that is because many of your Klan's people were pastors and Sunday school teachers, and they did that with the hood off, and then they did what they did with the hood on. And so, no, I'm not, because a lot of your sheriffs and a lot of your law people and lawyers, they were a part of the Klan. So when you say he's a Sunday school teacher, not surprised at that at all.
I would really suggest your readers, if you want to do something, this is a book that I use, is Robert Jones. He has a book called White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. And it's kind of a personal memoir a little bit too, but he talks about Barnett, and he talks about the impact, I think it's First Baptist Church at Jackson in Mississippi, on all of this too.
Right. Now, going back to the book, back to your piece in Illmatic Consequences, you use a term here that I never kind of put together, but after I saw it with you, it leaped out at me. White narcissism. It says, our view that we are the center of the world. I was like, oh, wait a minute. Now, I get narcissism on an individual level, but I had never put it together with the race like you did there. White narcissism. I was like, wow.
I swear, I look it up occasionally. So I wrote a piece about it. I think that Lillian and Paula have a piece basically on that, on narcissism, right? Like I said, how steep they are and everything else.
Right.
And that's what it essentially is. I mean, look at the quote. I'm sure you have the book in front of you on 184.
I do.
Right before the one you read a second ago. This one always stands out to me. So this is from Buying the New World with Old Confederate Bills. And this essay is kind of a pacifist essay. Lillian was a pacifist. But this is what she says. It is just possible that the white man is no longer the center of the universe, right? And narcissism is seeing yourself as the center.
Correct.
It is just possible that even German Nazis, British imperialists, and white Southerners will have to accept the fact that it has been old news. And I think that's the key, too. Will have to accept the fact that it's been old news to the rest of the world for a long, long time.
Correct.
Right? But it's still this continuation of saying that I am superior. And it gets back to the thing of, what do we want to teach our kids? I can't teach them this. I don't want to make them feel bad. Well, what about everybody else who is more of the world's population than you feeling bad because of what you've done?
And see, and that's what I was saying earlier in terms about, well, you don't want your kids to be traumatized, but you've traumatized everybody else's kids. It's like,
right.
Why is it that the white kids can't be traumatized? Why is it everybody else can be traumatized, but your kids can't? But this goes back again to the narcissism piece. And like I said, I never kind of heard it juxtaposed like that. Never heard those two words together in terms of a race. White narcissism. But when you get down to it, that's exactly what it is. When it says the center of the world, it is, I always get it, Jawanza Kufu, I forget, I think it's him or either it's the other one. But one of them says, in terms of seeing, because this was the whole thing about tearing down the statues and so forth and so on. And what he was saying was, the white race sees their greatness around them all the time. No matter where they look, turn left, right, up, down, white greatness is in front of you. What he says is the other races need to be just as vigilant in terms of having their greatness around them. And I'm paraphrasing. I think it's Jawanza Kunjufu. I think that's him. If it's not him, it was the other one. I always get two authors confused. But he says, white greatness is, you're surrounded by that. what needs to occur in the black race or in other races is just you put your greatness around you as well. See, when the whole statue thing about tearing down, I was not necessarily a fan of taking down statues. Like, well, you know what, they are what they are. But I am a fan of putting up our own, putting up ours. I think, everybody needs to be represented. That's the whole thing with social justice, is the whole notion of inclusion. The whole notion of not just like this says here, not just the white narcissist, the center of the world, because it's not. I mean, that passage you're in, I do have it in front of me. You're absolutely right. It says it is just possible that the white man is no longer the center of the universe.
Right.
It's there.
And it gets back to other things too. I mean, I have my own things with Confederate monuments, but you made me think about something else that I've kind of recognized and thought about lately too. I mean, you have South Africa's Reconciliation Conference, which I think there still issues in South Africa. I haven't done my research, so I don't totally know, but I think there still are. But you have places who have done reconciliation projects. Look at Germany with the Holocaust, right? They have reparations for Holocaust survivors. And whenever we think about reparations, I think there are different forms of,
right.
ways to do it.
Right.
But they do that, right?
Right.
The other thing, one of the other things I teach are novels about Japanese incarceration, during World War II.
Right.
People who were incarcerated, Japanese Americans, received reparations, right? Reagan put that into effect and apologized for it, right?
Right.
I didn't realize, too, that the Iranian hostages, the people who were hostages in Iran, just got reparations based on millions of dollars a couple of years ago.
Wow. See, I didn't know that either. That's something I learned new today, too.
How do you rectify if the conscience of Americans has been hurting since, the first white Christian enslaved the first black man? How do you rectify that? Those generations of
that's a very good.
That's the question to get to.
That is you're right. That is the essential question. And the thing is, and to see again, the fact that you now don't want it taught because you're afraid your kids are going to think their race is bad. That's amazing. And the book I was trying to cite, it's not Kwanzaa, it's Naeem Akbar. I don't know why I get Akbar and Kunjufu always confused, but it's Naeem Akbar, and it's his book, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. And that's where he talks about, white folks see white greatness everywhere they look. And, in terms of the other groups, they need to make sure they surround themselves with their greatness as well. Now, that's not to say you can't mix them up. That's not to say I can't have a picture of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King hanging up in my office. That's not what it's saying. But it is saying you need to have something that represents the contributions that you've made to the world around you also.
Right.
And it makes perfect sense to me. So again, I'm going down to your last piece in your essay. And again, listening audience, the book is Illmatic Consequences, the Clapback to Opponents of Critical Race Theory. The publisher of that book is Universal Right Publications, LLC. If you want to know more about that, go to www.uwpbooks.com. And Dr. Teutsch is the third contributor we've had on the show to this book, because it's a book of different essays. We had LaTanya White, we had Bijan Eric Jordan, and now we have Dr. Teutsch. And each of their contributions are thought-provoking. And as you read them, you really should get more insights into why we should not be clapping back or should not be pushing back critical race theory. If anything, we ought to be embracing it. And, we're constantly trying to push it away. But the last part of Dr. Teutsch's essay says, to counter Christian nationalism, we must, as Smith, 1942-1943, puts it, be like the men and women who fought back against the hypocrisies. I'm sorry. I'm telling you, hypocrisies of an empty, cowardly words of the segregated Christian churches and their parasitic preachers. We must be more loyal to Jesus than to white supremacy. Yes, we must, as the women who met at Junaluska put it in their slogan, be determined never for a moment to refuse hearing a truth because it is new, or to be afraid to dig under a belief because it is old and dearly loved. We must illuminate the entwining of Christianity and American patriotism, and we must be willing to learn and not be afraid of discovering that what we know and what we do serve to maintain white supremacy. It's not easy, but it must be done, because if we don't, the, quote, church-attending, moral-living, average men and women, unquote, will remain in the town square perpetuating white supremacy under the guise of religion, enacting violence against others through their words and actions. That's your conclusion. Talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity to promote, and we'll be out.
So there's two things there. I think the first thing is the Lillian Smith quote, and I mean, it goes back to what I was saying about Jesus' first sermon, right? And even if you go and read Isaiah, you know, one of the things that Isaiah says is, woe to those who makes unjust laws. I mean, does it get more kind of plain than that? Isaiah 10, but looking actually to the words of Jesus, if you look at what he did and what he fought against, I mean, you could even think about Jesus as, depending on the language you want to use, he was a terrorist. He was a political prisoner. He
Correct.
was a political outsider. So even the language we kind of use with describing him, he was a threat to the state.
Correct.
I mean, I think Killer Mike says that in Walking in the Snow. That's one thing. But he's quoting Dick Gregory, I think. But there's other people who say the same thing. I mean, if you really think about the way language works, that's what he was. But if you go back to his teachings, of course, the people he accepted, the people that he reached out to, and all of that were the poor and the oppressed. They were not
correct.
the ones in power.
That is correct. Matter of fact, he had big issues with the Pharisees.
Exactly. I mean, they're the ones who were trying to stone him, I think, after his first sermon.
Correct.
When he walked past him. But we have to fight back against, I like that phrasing from Smith, the hypocrisies of an empty, cowardly words, of the segregated Christians and their parasitic preachers.
Correct.
That phrase, parasitic, I think is really kind of powerful, because parasitic means that you're taking something without giving anything back.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
And one of the things that her and Paula did an issue in their journal, they did a journal from 36 to 45 on Christianity and race, basically. And there were a lot of publications about that time period, too, about that. But they interviewed people or had people send in submissions. And a couple of the pastors were like, yeah, church is basically a social club. It's basically about money. And that's that time. And in her book, Strange Fruit, one of the things, there's a minister who comes in. And Strange Fruit is an interracial romance. I'll say romance. I have issues with the book. But so the white guy gets the black girl pregnant.
Correct.
There's a minister who comes in and is doing a revival meeting, and he's the guy's mom wants the minister to talk to him. So the minister takes him out and basically tells him, there's a couple of things he tells him. One thing he tells him is, well, you can have Nani, who's the black girl, as your side piece, but you need to have a white woman and settle down, right? That's one thing. Another thing that he kind of tells either the white guy or somebody else, but he basically says, I'm here at the revival meeting. Get me a list of the most wealthy people in town who I can convert because they'll help, right? And one of the things that Smith notices in other works, I think he mentioned here too, is the people coming down to get saved aren't the wealthy.
That's right.
They're the ones who the wealthy are, oppressing, basically, which goes back to 2 Men in the Park. But anyways, that was a long divergence. But the key thing there is he's like, get me the wealthy people so that they can, fund my revival and fund me, basically. That's what I kind of take from parasitic, right? That in there, I think, that quote that you read, it's not easy, but it must be done, because if we don't,
right.
The quote, church attending, moral living, average men and women, that quote comes from Incognito. So when Zane is in prison and they're going to lynch his brother or cousin, I don't remember, but they're going to lynch his relative Alfonso because they think that he's the guy who's covering the things. They're going to lynch him in the
Right.
square. And the sheriff looks at Zane and says, the people out there doing that, they're the church-going people. That's where that quote comes from.
Right.
Like, they're going to go to church the next day, but they're out here lynching this guy.
No,
One
you're,
of the
you're
things
absolutely right.
One of the stories that Robert P. Jones tells at the beginning of his book, White Too Long, and I don't remember where, it's somewhere in Georgia, but that there was a church service right after all the churches let out, went to lynching. There were trains coming in from Atlanta to wherever, and that's it, and not one comment from, the pastors or anything about what was occurring.
Right.
But they murdered an individual, right, or individuals.
No, absolutely.
So-
There is a reason. Well, because when you just said that, it brought up a point. There's a reason. Once I learned, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I think it is. There's a reason I don't use the word picnic anymore, because if my understanding is correct, picnic was short for pica, and we know the N word. And so anytime now I talk about, cookouts or barbecues or anything, I don't use the word picnic, because exactly what you just described is exactly, it was an event. Like, we went to church and now we're going to go watch a lynching. Like, we picked a N word. If I wasn't on the air, I'd say it. But that's where, picnic allegedly comes from. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's what that's my understanding.
I'm about to say, I'm looking it up real quick. I'm not going to the Oxford English Dictionary. It looks like it's the early 1700s in Europe.
Right.
But again, the way we think about language, if we think about it like that, it makes sense.
It does.
And I wouldn't be surprised.
I wouldn't either. And that's why whenever I came across that, I stopped using the word immediately. Now, like I said, I don't know if it's true or not, but it does make sense. But I'm just saying that to say, what you just described is exactly what was described in that particular word, that it was an actual, it was a festival that we sat around eating as someone was being murdered. And it could have well been done after church.
So the opening of Incognito is a lynching. And the first page is the gathering. You have, like, a food cart. You have kids, like, eating food.
Right.
You have, he goes undercover basically as the photographer who would take pictures of the postcards. I mean, if you know your history, you know
Correct.
He took pictures and sold postcards.
Correct.
They would circulate parts of the body. If you look at famous pictures, there's the infamous, I would say, I guess, picture either in Texas or Oklahoma, but the guy's pointing at the victim, and there's kids in the picture.
Correct.
So there's two things that, again, God, like you said, we can go on for hours, but look up Reginald Marsh's painting, This Is Her First Lynching. It's 1935. It was part of the NAACP's an art commentary on lynching. Reginald Marsh was a white guy. That picture always strikes me because you don't see the victim, which is one thing that I like about the picture. It's focused on the perpetrators.
Correct.
And the title is This Is Her First Lynching, and it's a little girl being held up by women in the crowd looking to the left, and off page to the left is the victim. But she has her finger kind of up to her chin, like inquisitively looking. She kind of looks cherubic or angelic, while everybody else around her looks, grotesque.
Correct.
And it reminds me of James Baldwin's short story, Going to Meet the Man, which is a story about a sheriff who can't perform sexually unless he thinks about the lynching he attended as a kid.
Wow.
When his parents took him to a lynching. So there's a lot of kind of things there, and it was a party. It was. And that's why whenever you
referenced it at the possibility of that party being held after church, didn't surprise me. Because you've just been in there now praising the Lord, talking about love, and walk right out of the church and go to this party where you kill somebody.
Right.
So, yeah, I'm definitely going to have you back at some point so we can continue the discussion. What I'm going to do is, at this point, I'm going to let you promote. I'll allow you to promote in terms of, anything you want to promote. The only thing you can't say, Dr. Teutsch, is a dollar amount or a dollar figure or pricing or anything like that. Anything short of that, if you want to shout anybody out, if you want to talk about, any book signings or any other country or your blog or podcasts or anything else that you want the listening audience to know or contact you, I'm going to shut the mic off and allow you to do that. And then at that, we'll be done for this session because I definitely got to have you back. And let me tell you why this conversation has been so important to me, because in my mind, if change is going to happen, it's going to have to happen from your end. We can put, and we've historically always, and when I say we, I'm talking about the marginalized groups, the people of color, the oppressed, so forth and so on, whatever term you want to use. The change has always been from the bottom up, or at least because of course that's the ones that's had the boot on the neck. So of course the one with the boot on the neck is saying get your boot off. So, but in order for it to happen, the person with the boot on the neck has to take the boot off. And as long as the person with the boot or the foot on the neck is not willing to take that off, it's going to be a tough road. And so the fact that I'm talking to somebody who is considered a part of the folks who have the boot on the neck is saying what you're saying, that's encouraging.
Thank you.
No, seriously, that is encouraging. I have truly enjoyed this talk. So by all means, at this point, I'm going to shut the mic off. You can promote and then we'll be done. I'm going to have to, get in touch with you to see if I can have you back on at another time. So I'm going to shut the mic off. You promote however you like, and then we'll be out for the day.
So I do not have a Venmo, so no money amount. A couple of things I would suggest. Check out the Lillian E. Smith Center at Piedmont University. Just type in Lillian E. Smith Center. It's an artist residency. I mean, artist is pretty broadly defined as scholar, writer, photographer, whatever. She was a social justice activist, and it has a social justice, bent. We do educational programming through the Lillian E. Smith Center. So if you have school groups or organizations to Zoom in, or if you're around kind of the Georgia area for us to kind of visit you, you can email me at mteutzsch@piedmont.edu or at lescenter@piedmont.edu. The Lillian Smith Center is on Twitter, Facebook. I'm starting to get Instagram back up a little bit. I did it for a little while and didn't. I would suggest go and listen to our podcast, Dope with Lime. You can read about that. That was actually Lillian Smith's column in her journal that she published with Paula Snelling, but it's colloquial, or basically a term for cutting the sweetness of Coke with a lime, basically, and it was sweeter. You can also follow me, like Mark said, at Interminable Rambling. I'm on Medium and on WordPress. Medium is actually where I make a little bit of money from it if you read it. So I would suggest that. No dollar amount though again. Yeah, I think that's about. Oh well, I'll plug one more thing. So my daughter's about to be a senior next year. We just started a podcast called Classics and Coffee because we like coffee.
Right.
She reads a lot, and she's debating what she wants kind of her major to be in college. But we kind of came up with a podcast where she chooses a couple of books to read, and we talk about them, and I choose a couple of books. So we just did our first podcast on The Great Gatsby. That was kind of our joint one. I have big issues with The Great Gatsby, but I do like it. So that was our first one. The next one, I'll go and say them. The next one's going to be Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, which was her choice because it's one of her favorites. And I actually enjoyed it. I was kind of pleasantly surprised. I've read some Bronte stuff, but not a lot. The next one is William Gardner Smith's The Stone Face, which is a really fascinating and important book, I would say, about whiteness. It's a black guy from Philadelphia who moves to France to escape racism and segregation, but then he finds out how the French treat the Algerians. It's during the Algerian War. And it ends with actually the Paris Massacre in 1961. The next one is Adichie's Americana, which my daughter said is her favorite contemporary novel, which has a lot of these issues we're talking about in it. And she read it last year, and I had a friend text me. I texted a friend about it, and then she texted me back. She was like, does she have any questions yet? And I was like, no, I think that she kind of knows all these things. I mean, my daughter picked up I don't remember the author. No, I haven't read it, but she picked up a book called Hood Feminism when we were in D.C. So the thing she's reading, makes me kind of
good for her.
Hopeful.
Yes.
And then
good for her.
The last book we're going to do is Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, because I have to read it for class because I'm teaching in the fall. I got to reread it. So those are the books we're going to do. So these types of conversations, of course, will come up in there.
Well, I tell you what. Again, in order for change to happen, the conversations and the action must occur, and it has to occur from both sides. And so God bless you. God bless your daughter. And because that means things are changing. As the generations come across, things do have an opportunity or the potential for change. So, Dr. Teutsch, Matthew, I thank you so much. We are definitely, I'm going to get you back on here at some point to continue the discussion, because it is a critical discussion and it needs to be had. I am thrilled to have had the conversation with a white man, a Caucasian brother, in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in the words of him in terms of you being my white brother. And because at the end of the day, we're all human beings. That's the part. Like, I just heard you talking about those various books in France and so forth. At the end of the day, we're all human beings.
Right.
And so I'm definitely going to have you back on.
It's Genesis 1:27.
Exactly. Listening audience, it's the book, Illmatic Consequences, the Clapback to Opponents of Critical Race Theory. The publisher of that book is Universal Right Publications, LLC, www.uwpbooks.com. Dr. Teutsch, have a wonderfully blessed day, week. I will be in touch with you. I'll get the links to you. And once you get them, you are free to do whatever you'd like with them.
All right. You have a good day as well.
Thank you. Take care now.